In this short presentation, I'm going to tell you what is Edo.NET and how do you connect your application to the database. So let's go ahead and let's look at the two scenarios in which we can connect to the database. There are two ways in which you can use a database in your application. One is through a connected environment. The other one is through a disconnected environment. Now, what is the meaning of saying connected environment? Your application that you are writing, you have it on one side and you have the database on the other side. Somehow you make the connections with the database by supplying the username, password and all the connection string and so on. You establish the connections with the database. Then you send a query and get the result. And if at all you have to send one more update and so on, you will send all of them one after the other. And at the end, once you have completed all your transaction, you disconnect from the database. So why it is called as connected? Throughout this, there may be many such requests. Throughout the request, you are actively connected to the database. So you establish the connection with the database and you disconnect only when either your application terminates or you don't have any other thing to be done with the database. What is the disconnected model? In the disconnected model, you slightly modify the way in which you access the database. So you make a connections with the database, send the query and get back the result. Once you get the local copy of the result, and if at all you have to further process this result on the other side, and if it takes a lot of time, you disconnect from the database. So you make a connection, get what you want from the database, and you disconnect from the database. Then, with the local copy of the data that you have received from the database, you process that data here in the client side. And if at all you want to make the update again, so whatever new results that you have generated here after processing, if at all you want to send it back to the database, you re-establish the connection again, then send the data back to the database and disconnect. So you will notice the difference between this and the previous interaction. In this interaction, you are connecting to the database only when it is absolutely required. Whereas here, in the previous diagram, you will notice that you take the data from the database and you will take some time to process the data that is received from the database. During the processing, you are not interacting with the database, but you still have an active connection with the database. So, this is actually a wastage. The wastage in the sense, when you are doing the processing on the local data, you are still connected to the database. That is why it is a waste. Why it is a waste? Because if you leave this connection, somebody else can connect to the database. For example, if you take a really enterprise application, there will be many clients who may be interested in connecting to the database. If you establish a connection and if you don't release the connection, then and there what will happen is all of them are blocked. So you know very well the database will not accept, you can go on accepting the connection. There is a limit up to which the database can connect. So when that limit is reached, the others will not be able to communicate with the database just because you have not released the connection to the database. So one, you have a connected access model, the other one is the disconnected model. In the disconnected model, what you do is you establish the connection to the database only when it is absolutely required. When you are doing processing on the local data, you disconnect it from the database so that connection can be given to some other client. Now let's look at what are the advantage of connected as well as the disconnected environment. So what is the advantage? The main advantage of the connected environment is it is simple. The reason it is simple is because you are making a connection at once Once a secured connection is made, you are using that connection again and again. So that is good part. The other good thing about the connected environment is at any time, whatever value that you are using in the local process is the updated or the real-time value. What happens in the disconnected environment? In the disconnected environment, you take a chunk of data from the database and then start working on that particular data. Now, what may happen during this time? During this process, so once you have got the data from the database, you are working on this data, but what may happen is on the other side, somebody else may get connected to the database and they may start modifying the data. So in this case, what will happen is you are working with one set of data, but at the back side, somebody else has gone to the database and made some additional modification. That will not be highlighted. The reason is when you are working with the local copy, you have already disconnected from the database. So that means what you have now is a local copy, which the real copy can be, it is not always, there can be a possibility that somebody may go here and then make changes to the data. So that is the problem with the disconnected environment. Let's come back to the advantage of the connected environment. In the connected environment, that scenario won't happen because you are already connected and you may have a lock on the particular table or particular records while doing the updation. That's the reason you can be always 100% sure that whatever you are doing is you are doing it with the real data. Okay. The other good part of this is it helps in the distributed organization. That means you take the data, you have the client at one place, you have the data at the other place, and when you want, you go to the database, get the data and use it. What is the disadvantage of this? Disadvantage of this is you are continually using the connection. So you are not relieving the connection. In other words, you are not allowing others to make a connection with the database. You are blocking the others from getting connected to the database. The other bad part of it is this cannot be used in the internet environment, wherein you cannot guarantee a 100% active connection with the server. You know very well, internet, and if you compare internet with the intranet, that is your local network. Local network, you can be 100% sure that you are always connected to the server. Whereas in the internet, it is not the case. The connection can go or connection can get disconnected at any time, and the package may arrive at a different time and so on. You have all the other problem that is associated with the internet. The data may not be available because of the congestion and so on. So this scenario, connected environment, works only with the local environment and it cannot be used with the internet environment. Now let's go to the advantages of the disconnected scenario. In the disconnected scenario, you are using the server resources in an economic way. What is the meaning of saying you are using the server resources in the economic way is when you want the resource of the database, you establish the connection and then disconnect it. That means you are not simply wasting the network resources. You are not simply keeping one test signal sending from your machine to the server machine and keeping that one line alive when you are not using it. The other advantage of it is it does not require a continuous connection. So in the internet environment where you cannot enforce a 100% connection every time, so the connection can go, the line can go down at any time, this scenario is very useful. What is the bad part of it? The bad part of it is the problem with the updation. So when you are using your local copy, somebody may go to the database and make the changes to the values. So you have seen many such problems. The read-write problems that are associated with the database table in your database classes, so I won't go in depth into it. Okay, and the last part is you cannot always ensure that the data is up to date. So because somebody else can always make modification to it. Now coming back to the Edo.NET, what is Edo.NET and why do we have to use this? Edo.NET is nothing but it's a set of libraries that helps us to interact with the data sources. So whenever we are using the .NET framework, if at all we want to interact with the databases, we don't have to write the program from the scratch. There are already some libraries which are available which can be readily used and which will help us to easily establish the connection with the database, send a query to the database and retrieve the values and handle the transaction. So it's a set of libraries for the interacting with the data sources. When I say data sources, data source does not mean that it is database alone. So data source could be a database, data source could be an XML document, data source could be a web service, or data source could be any source, a legacy application from which you want to access the data. Okay. What does these libraries will do? These libraries have classes that abstract the interaction with the database. So that, in other words, it hides all the complications that are involved in communicating with the database. Okay. Now let's look at the actual place wherein the Edo.NET comes into your application. You might have written a Windows application, or you may today you are going to write a web application, and maybe some other class you may write a web service. So these are all the clients that wants to make use of the data which is there in the database. What these classes will do is they cannot directly, not the classes, what these clients will do is they will not directly interact with the database. Instead, they interact with the Edo.NET, and Edo.NET in turn will interact with the database. Again, if you are not very sure, very specific about the Edo.NET, Edo.NET is the updated version of the Edo technology that was being used. Before that, there was the other technologies that Visual Basic was using. I won't go in history into those things. This is something that is not created or incarnated with the .NET. This is an updated version of the previous technologies that the Microsoft was using, and Edo stands for Active Data Object. So this is Active Data Object shortcut for the acronym, or it is Edo, so it is Edo.NET. So I can't remove one of my hand because of the problem with the connection. So this is the Edo.NET. We use the word Edo or Edo just to give, this is an acronym for this Active Data Object. So somebody may say, what is Active Data Object? Active Data Object is also same. Edo is the acronym for it. So what does this Edo.NET or what does this libraries will do? They act as an intermediary between your application and the database system. So it is a mediator between you and the database. What are the things that the Edo.NET provides? So the first thing is it provides a managed data access. What do we mean by saying managed data access? You are already familiar when I told you something about the CLR. I told you something. CLR also manages the code, and when it is CLR, we say that CLR handles the memory, garbage collection, and so on. What about the Edo.NET? How does Edo.NET manage the data access? When we talk about the Edo.NET, Edo.NET helps us establishing a connection with the database, and Edo.NET helps us to disconnect from the database. So that is one part of managing. Establishing the connection, disconnecting the connection, one part of the management. Next one is, you are already familiar, whenever you are using a database have different data types. we have numerical data types when you use the database. You have varchar, nvarchar, but there is nothing called as nvarchar and varchar in your Java or in other programming language that you have studied, including the C#. So your integer, your float, your double that you are already familiar with your programming language has to be mapped to the corresponding data type which are there in the tables of the database. And who is going to do that thing? This mapping is taken care by the Edo.NET. So the work of the Edo.NET is to securely connect. So when you say float, the precision has to be properly managed on the other side. When you say double, the double is highly precise number that has to be stored on the database or that has to be retrieved from the database. Okay, so this part is taken care. So there are two aspects of the Edo.NET. One is the helping in the establishment of the connection and disconnecting the connection. The other one is managing the type safety. Now this diagram is already familiar to you. I have explained the architecture, and where does this Edo.NET come into picture? You know very well the .NET framework itself contains the one of the component Edo.NET. So it is part of the .NET framework itself. Let's look at the components which are there within the Edo.NET. Edo.NET consists of two major components. One is called as content components, other one is called as managed provider components. So when you look at the Edo.NET, you end up in getting two separate categories of classes. One set of classes belongs to content component, the other set of classes are called as managed provider. What is this content components and what are this managed provider? The word itself says they contain something, so that's why it is called as content. So it holds something. So what does it hold? Naturally they hold the actual data. So they are the one which gathers the data from the database. What is managed provider component? So managed provider, I told you what is the meaning of saying managed. Edo.NET manages something. Managed has to do with the actual interaction with the database, establishing the connection to the database and retrieving it back from the database, and that is what is managed provider. So how many classes are there? Don't worry about these classes. These may look very strange to you, but if you remove this data from all these classes and if you start looking at them, you know very well contents are something that holds the data, and you know very well in a database which can hold the data is a table. So there is an equivalent class in .NET that you can say that depicts the table in your database, and you are already familiar. The one that holds the data is the view, even though you may say that view is actually a snapshot of what is being shown and so on. If here it belongs to the content side. What others can hold the data is the rows and column within your table, and you may also have a relationship between the row in one table and the row in the other table. You may have many such tables in your database, and the data sets holds many such tables. So data set contain many tables, tables contain number of rows, rows contain number of columns. So for to have that relationship, we have equivalent number of classes. Now coming to the other side, what are managed providers? Managed providers help in establishing the connection and retrieving the data and sending the update. So when you run a query, select star from the database, the query has to be sent from your application to the database. That is taken care by the managed provider. Once the query is executed on the database, it's going to send a set of data or set of records back to you, and that is held inside the content component. So you have content components, you have managed providers. Now this diagram, you have to somehow get this diagram in your mind whenever you are developing the application using Edo.NET, because they are the major components that you will be using throughout your life if at all you are using the Aero.NET. Now let's look at what you said and what are the things. All of them are very simple. This side is your data consumer. Who is this data consumer? Your application. That is either a console application, Windows Form application that you have created in the lab, or a ASP.NET application, or any application that requires a communication with the database. And you notice here, this diagram does not show anything of database or database management system. Why it does not show anything about the data or the database management system? I will show you the first diagram that was shown to you, not this one. You notice over here, your applications are interacting with the Edo.NET. It is not interested in knowing what happens beyond that. So I want to get a 220 volt AC to my laptop, that is for my adapter, and I am only interested in searching which among them is giving me the power. I don't know what happens beyond this part, and I am least bothered about what happens on the other side of the world. Okay. Similarly, your application wants the data from the database. It knows that Edo.NET can do that. So it only interacts with the Edo.NET. How Edo.NET actually establishes the connection with the database, that is the problem of the Edo.NET, and we will not bother about that. So that is why this diagram, you will notice that nowhere it is shown that there is a database, because we are least bothered about it. Okay. Now, in order to establish a connection with the database, you need to have a connection with the database. That's a simple thing. So, without connecting to the database, it's not possible to get or update the data in the database. So, naturally, you have a object called as connection object. So, what is the use of that connection object? Its work is to just establish a connection with the database. So, its work is only that. Search for the database, get a hook onto the database. That's all. Then its work is over. Now, if I generally ask you a question, how do you make a connection with the database? What are the things that you must know in order to establish a connection with the database? What are the things that has to be known by you in order for you to establish a connection with the database? What are the things? If at all you want to make a connection with the database, what information you must have? Database path, the exact location where you can find the database server or the database. So the path of the database, the name of the database, username and password. What else must be known? Driver. In other words, you must know which is the database vendor. Is it a Oracle? Is it a MySQL? Is it a MS Access, or is it something else? So you need that information, and you need to communicate with the database in its native language. What do you mean by saying native language? Not all the database will interact to you in any way you like it. The way in which it accepts and sends the request, or accepts the request and sends the response back, there is a specific way. Every database varies, and you must know that thing. Naturally, the connection object must take all of them into consideration. So what's the use of connection object? Connection object is responsible for establishing the connection with the database. Once you establish the connection, what are you going to do? Once you are connected to the database, what you are supposed to do? Once you open that PLSQL command, and once you type the username, password, and the local host or anything, what you do then? What you do then? Yeah, what is that? Create table, select, what is that? All of them are, in a simple common language, all of them are commands. So once you establish the connection, you have to send the command. Okay. Now I am not saying that to send a command using the command prompt or PLSQL prompt that you are getting there, you are doing it through a program. So your program, the way in which you have written the command, that has to be sent to via this connection to the database. And who will represent the command in your application is this command object. So the command object is responsible for sending the command to the database. So once a command is sent to the database, what will happen? Either the database may update its value, or it may send back a result set. Are you familiar with that word? Result set? Okay. So it may send the result set back to you. Now you notice that there is a split here. One side goes to the adapter, the other side goes to the reader. So there are two other pieces that are connected. Whether it is this adapter or whether it is a reader, I have not told you what are those two things, but regardless of what are they are supposed to send a command using that command object. Now what's the difference between this adapter and reader? The word says reader means it is going to read. So that's why that name has come there. Reader. Its work is to read. So when I say its work is to read, what does that mean? Its work is not to update the database. So that is why it is called as reader. It knows how to read, but it doesn't know how to update. Okay, so it knows how to read the content which is there in the table of a database, but it does not know how to write back to the database. Now you may be thinking, so why somebody has to do that thing? Remember, not all the times you will update the database. You have gone to maybe Karnataka when your SSLC result came, when your PUC result came, or maybe when your degree results were out. You went to a website and you started searching for your register number or the hall ticket number. What you are doing, you are not updating your marks. Most of the time you just want to see. When you want to reserve a ticket in KSRTC, or when you want to reserve a ticket in the train for your railways, first thing you are doing is you are just reading how many of them are available. So that is why the reader, most of the time what you do is you read, you show the details, and that is why it is there. However, there is some additional thing that reader will do. This reader is forward only. What is the meaning of saying forward only? It knows how to go in forward direction. It does not know how to go back. What's the meaning of that? It can read the first row, it can go to the second row, third row, fourth row, fifth row. It can go in that order. After fifth row, you can't ask it, go back to the first row. It won't do it. So it's just forward only. Once you start reading, the pointer goes in one direction. You can't make the pointer to go back to the previous record and then ask it. So after 20th record, you can't ask the reader, okay, now go back to the first record. I want to read from the first record. It's not possible. So it is only in one direction. It's like your water pipe. You open it, the water will come on one direction. You cannot send the water on the other direction. So that is how it behaves. However, there is one other thing that you must know about the reader, and that is, in order to use this, you have to have a continuous connection with the database. So it will not work in the disconnected environment. What is the meaning of that? As long as the connection is there, it will read. If the connection goes down, it will not be able to read the record. That means it is reading in a stream. Are you familiar with the word called stream? Yes? Stream of water, not the stream in the Java and other thing. Stream, you know, you go to Joke Falls, you get the water falling down, that is all. It just comes down. If somebody builds a bridge on top of, builds a dam on top of that Joke Falls, no water will come down. So some same thing happens. As long as the connection is there, it gets that stream. Somebody breaks that connection, it's all gone. You will have to re-establish and redo the thing. So what is reader object? Reader object is read only, forward only, connected way of establishing or using the data. So if you want to have a connected What's the meaning of saying connected? What's the meaning of saying connected? You are disconnecting from the database at the end, not in the middle. What is disconnected way? Only when you want, you establish the connection and get the data. After that, you disconnect. Whereas in the read only, the reader is connected. What's the meaning of that? Whether you are reading it or not, it has to have the connection with the database. So if you establish the connection early morning at 8 o'clock, and if you keep your application on till 12 o'clock at night, it will keep that connection. As long as that connection is there, reader will read it. Somewhere in middle, internet goes down or your network goes down, you lost the connection and you will have to redo it. So reader object is read only, forward only, connected way of accessing the data. What about the adapter? Adapter is exactly opposite to that of the reader. Reader is connected. What will happen to the adapter? What may happen to the adapter? If this is connected, it is disconnected. So it's a disconnected way of using the database. This is read only. That means it cannot update it. What about the data adapter? It can update the database. So data adapter can not only read, but it can also update the content in the database. Now let's come back to again it is forward only, but you can jump to any other location using the data adapter. More flexible than the data reader. Now then, why they have the reader? Why can't just they use this adapter every time? Reader, the overhead is very less. Because the reader is only meant for reading it. Remember, when you want to buy a product in the online shopping mart, what you do is you will get the list of all the items. That is just reading the content from the database. So you go to eBay or you go to any other website for that matter. 99% of the time, most of the users are just reading. So reader is best meant for that. You read everything. Show the page, disconnect from the database. Okay. What about data adapter? Can I use the data adapter for reading it? This is slightly heavy duty, so people like to use the data reader. Now the next thing is, this is a disconnected way of establishing or disconnected scenario that you are using. So what does that mean? You establish the connection with the database, get the data whatever that you want, and then disconnect it from the database. So this is what is happening. You establish a connection with the database, retrieve the result, and after that, because it is disconnected, you are disconnecting from the database. So the connection is lost. What will happen to all the data that you have retrieved from the database? So you have run a select start from my table. So when you run select start from my table, all the records from the my tables are written back to you. What will this data adapter do with that data? Data adapter will not hold those data with it. Whatever that comes from the database, it places it inside the data set. So it reads the data from the database and fills the data set. Okay. It reads the data from the database, whatever number of records, whatever you have, it reads it, fills the data set. What is data set, by the way? What's the data set? Data set, I will just write it here because I don't have all the things with me. So we have, what is data set? I'm not writing Windows one. What is data set? Data set is a collection of data table. What is one data table? Data table is a collection of number of rows. What is one row? Row is a collection of number of column. In other words, data set is a collection of many tables. So you have many tables. You can read the data, fill the local copy. So in the database you have the tables in the database. So if you have the database over here, within the database you have the table. You read the data from the table and you fill the local copy of the table in your application. When I say here, I mean to say in the data set. So you read from the database, you fill the data set. Once the data set is filled, you disconnect from the database. It's no longer required, you disconnect it, and then what you do? You work with the local copy. That is how you are using it. So you go to the database, read the data, fill the local copy, disconnect it from the database. Then onwards, database is not required because you got the local copy. Work with the local copy. Suppose if you want to update this new copy, so you took the local copy, you are making all the changes to the local copy. Now if you want to update this new copy back to the database, what you will do? Again, establish a connection using the adapter. Ask the adapter to take this data back to the database. So this is how we are doing. Go to the database, get what you want, fill it inside the data set, update it, do anything with it. If you want this new things to be reflected back onto the database, take this updated modified copy, give it back to the data adapter and ask the data adapter, okay, I want the things to be reflected on my database. It will take all the updated row, automatically it will highlight it onto the database. Okay, so this is the explanation for what I have shown you there. Data provider consists of the connection object, which provides a connection to the database, command object, which is used to execute the command, data reader, which is forward only, read only connected record set, and the data adapter is used to populate the disconnected data set. Okay, I will stop at this point. We have many things to be done. We will look at the other part once we have done one exercise in the during our labs. So when we have this lab session, we will be able to appreciate that. Now let's go back to the thing. So you must, I will tell you where are those pieces when we do the lab exercise. So yesterday we have talked about common language infrastructure. In short, what is common language infrastructure? Now very quick answer for this. What is common language infrastructure? Yes, common language infrastructure has to do with one word called as infrastructure. What is the meaning of saying infrastructure? Infrastructure is this environment. So you say college has a good infrastructure. What is the meaning of saying that? You have AC, you have a projector, you have everything. So that full boundary that you get across the campus is your infrastructure. That contains the trees, plants and dogs, everything. So similarly, infrastructure contains everything. Okay. So that is what is common language infrastructure. It's an infrastructure for what? For developing languages. Suppose if you are very much enthusiastic about this .NET and you want to write your own programming language, how do I build it? So in that case, it's required. So it's a specification that was created by Microsoft and it was given to the ISO for including the ECMA for that. What does it says? It describes the executable code. What is the meaning of saying it describes the code? It says how the code must look like. When I say how the code must look like, I am not saying the code must have the class or the for, while loop, the if condition. It's not the one. Once it is compiled, how it must look like. What is the meaning of saying once it is compiled? If you compile a .NET application, .NET program, what you get? For the first time, if you compile a .NET program, what you get? Do you get a machine code? If you compile a C# program, what you get? Do you get a machine code? Intermediate code, you know very well, the bytecode. So it is a description of how the bytecode must look like. Okay, so let's look at the one. I think if I'm connected, I'd like to show you that site that will help you out to understand what is that I'm talking about. You are already familiar with the .NET, and I'm going to say, so I'll go to this mono project, mono-project.com. Okay, mono project is the implementation of that specification. So I told you common language. The story what I am telling you is, now if at all your .NET has to run on the Linux environment or the Mac environment, so there must be that specification. So this is a cross-platform open source .NET development platform for the Linux as well as Mac. Suppose if you want to run your Mac, what you are going to do? So if you notice over here, there is already, suppose if you are using the Xemian or any other one, you can just click on it and download. Now what you are going to download is not the .NET for Windows, you are going to get the .NET for the Linux. Okay, so if you want to get it, you can go here to the download, and if the connection is fast, you will be able to see the list of the OS that you want to download. So for the Mac OS, for your Sun Solaris, for OpenSUSE, or you can take it for any other, or the other Linuxes for Ubuntu. You have it here. So .NET for Ubuntu. Go there, download it. This package is available, and the entire story is available that you can use it. Now, how did somebody wrote this particular thing on Ubuntu? They went through the documentation that is provided in the CLI. So CLI is the specification. Suppose if I want to my .NET for my XYZ Linux distribution, what I'm supposed to do? Go to that CLI specification, read it, and then implement it. Okay, so what are the things which are there in the CLI? So I told you your campus contains many things. So here when I say infrastructure, it contains many things. What are those many things? Common type system, metadata system, common language specification, and virtual execution system. What is common type system? What's the meaning of saying type? What do I mean refer by saying type? Single word. What is a type? Equivalent of type. It's like the data type. Are you getting it? Type means data type. What are the common data types that must be there in your programming language? So, can I have integer in my, suppose if I am developing my own programming language called as D# or K# or J#, something of my type, like how C# is there. Suppose if I develop, what are the, remember, base minimum things, these are bare minimum things that must be there. The data types that must be supported, how it must be represented in the memory. That common set which must be available through all the programming language, so that the data type that you have created in C# can be easily used in the VB or maybe C++. So common set of data types that must be available in all programming language, so that I can take a data from one programming language and give it to the other programming language. What is this? These are the specifications, how the data must look like. Okay? And that is what is represented. Okay? So it defines a common set of types that can be used with many different programming languages. So the common type could be anything that you have. Okay. Now remember, each language is free to define their own syntaxes. The specification does not say that the statement must be terminated with a semicolon. That's not their problem. Statement may terminate with the semicolon, or you may not terminate it with the semicolon. That's not the specification. What are the fundamental data types that must be there? That is there. So you must have an int type. Everybody must have an int type. Can they have int x type? That is their problem. They can have it, they don't have it, that's their problem. Can they have a long If it is there in the specification, it's well and good. If the specification says everybody must define something called as float, then all the programming language must have a float. So float in C#, it has to be mapped to the standard version of the float that is represented in .NET. Okay. Then we have, there are two types. There are two types that you have here, and that is, one is the value type and the other one is the reference type. What is value type? What is value type? Variables directly contain the values. Where do you store the value types? In this type. What is reference type? They are pointing to a location in the heap, and you have already seen that thing. I won't go in depth into it. And the next part is the metadata. What is metadata? The data that describes what your code should be. Now the question is, why do you want that kind of thing in programming? I think I stopped at this point. Why do you want this metadata in your programming language? Now let's assume that, again I don't have, I can't remove my finger. Now here you have this C# program, and you create person. I will not type it. You create something called as person, and then you create a student. What is student? Student is an extended version of person, is it not? You have this inheritance. Are you familiar with that inheritance? You have something called as a person. You say person has a name and so on and so forth. Then finally you say that student is a person. Are you familiar with that relationship called as is a? Yes. So there are one class called as person class. There is one class called as student class. This was written using C#. Now if you want to use this in VB, then when you take this student, VB must understand that student is dependent on the person, or what are the methods which are there inside student and so on. How does that know? See, VB cannot understand the syntaxes that was created. How to use this? What is the return type of a method? If you say add marks to the student, what is the data type it takes? What is the return value? What is the access specifier? What is this word access specifier? Can you name some access specifiers? Public, private, and so on. Okay. So what access specifiers are there? All these details are placed in the metadata. So the metadata will tell what are the things required. So what are the dependencies of your class, on which other class your class depends on, or how to call a method, what is the access specifier. All these details will be there. So metadata is used to describe the compiled intermediate code. Remember, metadata is not the remark statement that you are writing in your C# or the remark statement that you might have written in VB or any other things. When we say metadata, I'm talking about the remark statement of this IL, that is the intermediate language. Okay. So when you create this .NET compiled version, that is IL, the metadata can be used to describe how many classes are there within a package. We call that package in .NET, we call this package as assembly. I'll talk about this one. So you are saying this is assemblies. I can't write it. Okay, so assemblies in Java you call that as packages. So here we call it as assembly. More about the assemblies in the other slides. So within the assembly, how many classes are there? You know very well a package contains number of classes. So similarly, assembly contains number of classes. How many classes are there? What is the relationship between one class and the other class? How to call a method within the one class? All these details will be available. And I think in the last class I have told you that I am going to show you the metadata. Now, in order to get this metadata, if you have installed the version 2012 or 2013, this will not be available at the command prompt. Okay, so you don't see this IL DASM. It is also called as MS DSMR or IL DASM. This is the utility LDASM. What is ASM? What is ASM? Have you heard about that word somewhere? Assembler. Have you heard about that assemblers? Have you used it? What may be DASM is deassembler. Okay. What is the meaning of saying what does assembler will do? Convert the assembly language into what may be deassembling then? Doing it in the reverse way. From the machine instruction, get the assembler. Okay, so this is the assembler. Now I am not getting it from, remember that, I am not getting it from the machine instruction, I am getting it from the assembled code. When I say assembled code, the IL code. So in the last class, maybe somewhere, what you have done is, I will go to this D drive and I will go to this MCA project, and you created an application called as XML Weaver, and I will open, this is the executable file that was created. This was the one that is running your application. I'll open that thing. Okay, so if you really want to know, what I have done is I went to D drive to MCA project and this assembler and VBAT. I'm not using Visual Studio now, I'm directly executing it. This is the program that you have done. Okay, this is the one that contains the IL code. So your intermediate code is available inside it. So what I have done is I have opened that file in my deassembler. Now I told you that there is going to be a IL code. IL code is not a machine instruction, it is a byte code. Okay. Have you created a form 1? Do you remember that you created a form 1? So you have all the things which are there. Did you remember that you created something called as build tree? Yes. So this is there. And I double clicked on it, just double clicked on that, and you notice this is the instruction that is not the assembly level instruction. This is the IL instruction that is read by CLR. So CLR is reading this thing. Don't worry about it. We will see. We'll use this in the lab to find out what is there inside it. Now I am not interested in the IL. This is the IL. What is IL? Intermediate language. Okay. So you see something called as manifest. Okay. I double click on it, and you will see something called as the metadata. So your code metadata will be available. You may not be able to get the head and tail out of it, but it is the metadata. So that is what is the meaning of saying metadata. That describes, that says what are the dependencies of your program. For example, you created form 1. Form 1 is a derived version of system.windows.form. So your form 1 has to be derived from something else, and that is the dependency. So there is an external dependency. That's what it is saying. I'll come back to that in the lab.